The views and opinions expressed by Occam's Lantern are my own, and are not reflective of the Church of Satan, nor are they of other fellow Satanists. Satanism is an atheistic religion founded by Anton LaVey in the year 1966. It champions individualism, rational thought, indulgence in life's many joys, and a rejection of supernatural beliefs. However, it embraces man's need and enjoyment of ritual, and instead posits that the supernormal and the power of one's will can fill that void. Those are my own words defining the matter of what is Satanism. Others have variations. Words can and do change. It's how language evolves. However, certain things are rooted and are immutable regardless of opinion. Say I, dressed in a stereotypical Jesus costume, preached that fish are the only acceptable life mates to a person and disregard everything in the Christian Bible. Could I still call my practices Christianity? Of course not. Why is it then that when it comes to Satanism, so many people seem to be assured that it can just be whatever they want it to be, or use a costume and some associated bit of the lore as their own interpretation of it? Today's episode serves as both an exploration of Satanism and a definition as set forth by its founders and followers, as well as the stark reality of what it is not. Myths and legend. History and hysteria. Religion and the far reaches of the occult. These and more are the children of a common thing: belief, an intrinsic part of what makes us human. I am your host, Liam Blackwood, an independent scholar of esoterica and eccentricities, a rational skeptic, father of two, writer, and general lover of life. Pull up a chair, fellow lamplighters, and let us cast the shadows back a bit as we examine what lies in the light of Occam's Lantern. And welcome back to Occam's Lantern. This is week 2 of our scheduled Friday releases. We're going to be doing this moving forward, trying to avoid burnout, and also getting a nice little backlog of episodes, just in case I'm delayed or indisposed for a week. So, this one was very tempting to release early, and we'll get into the reasons why in a little bit later. But before we do, a bit of news. Just received our business cards to distribute locally, so that will be a fun bit of indulgence and hopefully get some new viewers and, well, listeners for that. And on that note, we are also on Patreon now, so if you would like to support the channel at $5 a month, that'll go straight into advertising and hopefully bringing more lamplighters to the fireside. So, why was I tempted to release this episode early? Well, it could have been just pride that I had completed the episode and said, hey, this is a good one, let's push it out. But the reality is that the word Satanism has been getting a lot more media attention as of late, especially on Facebook and other social media platforms, and I wonder why. What happened? What publicity stunt could have set this all off? It seems ever since this debacle with Twin Temple gained traction enough, everybody and their mum has an idea of what Satanism is. Strangely enough, I'd already finished writing this episode before any of that happened, so I had to go back and revise a few sections. I always do these intro pieces and the preamble immediately before recording so I can insert relevant topics and news bits that have come up since then. If you are unfamiliar, Twin Temple is a devil doo-wop music group, combining those two elements into catchy tunes dripping with infernal aesthetic. I don't mind their stuff. I haven't heard a lot of it. Some of it's catchy. One or two pieces I've heard can get a little repetitive. But all that aside, in a nutshell, they were set to open for some country artist I've never heard of. And when he started actually paying attention, his reaction was, "What in the tarnation? I ain't having no devil worshippers." And he booted them off the tour. Cue the pity party from the internet and those pseudo-Satanist masses poking out from every corner to play their silly little games. Of course, this all seemed like an engineered promotional tactic that got both sides of the issue major publicity and landed Twin Temple several lofty gigs and promotions. I posted this on the matter when I first heard the news cross my desk, and this is a direct quote from my Facebook. You use satanic imagery to make a buck, you deal with the consequences while reaping the rewards. This as an actual Satanist, not just along for the images and aesthetics. Enjoy the success you have due to it, and don't blink twice when someone goes the holy roller route on you. Especially don't turn it into a pity party that's only goal is moral one-upsmanship and no small amount of publicity. Well, that was the post back in July 10th. And since then, I have been doused in a deluge of people who seem to believe they know exactly what Satanism is. And boy, did this episode get a facelift due to it. We'll touch on that, especially the Satanic Temple, and what defines a religion. So, before we begin, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a religion as an organized system of attitudes, beliefs, and practices. There are foundational texts, tenets, founders, members, etc. And all of these came into existence in the years between 1966 and 1970 as codified by Anton LaVey, and continue to exist to this day. There's no satanic denominations, no need to use the term LaVeyan any more than one would call it Smith Mormonism or Jesus Christianity. All other examples people throw out as other forms of Satanism have nothing to do with the religion as it was codified, nor do they share a foundational text or beliefs. We will get more into this later, and as always, if you want to hear these things from someone with a bit more authority on the matter, I highly suggest the Satansplain podcast, hosted by Magister Bill M., longtime member of the Church of Satan. Okay, so longest and most vitriolic bit of introduction ever. Let's finally get into the meat of the episode. And I would like to reiterate again that these are my own thoughts on the matters at hand, on the 9 statements, on the satanic sins, on pentagonal revisionism. If you want to read and understand these concepts, I suggest you go straight to the source, churchofsatan.com. And for more in-depth analysis, again, check out the Satansplain podcast. There are episodes doing a deep dive into all of these, covering them far more than I do in this episode. And the great thing about most of these statements, sins, and visions is that they are interpretable. And I don't mean to say that as in you can make up your own meaning for them, because there is a very strict meaning to them. However, as Satanism at its core is about individuality, then your interpretations of these are your own. Now, that doesn't mean that you can go making up your own meaning for each of these, but there is wiggle room as to how you apply them to yourself. Before we can answer the question, what is Satanism, we have to spend a little time discussing something that sounds similar, but is in reality an entirely different creature. For nearly 2,000 years, satanic wasn't an identity anyone claimed. It was an accusation, a label, a convenient way of saying those people over there are the enemy. Lowercase s, pejorative. The earliest Christians were accused by Romans of secret cannibalistic rituals before they spoke of eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. Christians, in turn, would later accuse pagans, rival sects, heretics, witches, political enemies, freethinkers, and just about anyone who threatened the established order of serving the devil. Rarely was any evidence required. Once the accusation existed, the burden shifted to the accused to somehow prove they were not in league with the devil. That pattern repeated itself for centuries. The medieval witch hunts were never uncovering an organized satanic religion. They were extracting confessions under torture from terrified people who would eventually admit to almost anything if it meant the pain might stop. Every grotesque image we now associate with witches emerged not from reality, but from the imagination of inquisitors determined to justify the conclusions that their addled minds had already reached. Ironically, many of the symbols we now think of as satanic only became associated with the devil because Christianity gradually absorbed older pagan imagery into its vision of evil. Horns belonging to Pan, hooves belonging to woodland spirits. The goat had long represented fertility and abundance before becoming an icon of damnation. The devil himself had become a collage assembled from the religions Christianity had displaced. By the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, another phenomenon began to emerge. If the church insisted that every act of rebellion was satanic, then some people began wearing that accusation almost as a secret badge of honor. Not because they believed in Satan, but because it scandalized respectable society, or maybe as a raised finger or bitten thumb in the face of religious dogma. Now this is where things begin to get interesting. Enter Sir Francis Dashwood. Now, history has not always been kind to accuracy when discussing the infamous Hellfire Club. Depending on who's telling the story, they were either enlightened philosophers with an immature sense of humor, decadent libertines indulging in every vice imaginable, or genuine devil worshippers conducting black masses under candlelit ruins. The truth was likely less dramatic. Dashwood was a wealthy English nobleman with enough money that boredom became its own affliction. In the 18th century, he gathered politicians, artists, aristocrats, and individuals into what had become known as the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wycombe, far better remembered today as the Hellfire Club. They met in former abbeys and caves decorated with deliberately blasphemous imagery. They drank excessively and mocked religion. They held elaborate dinners and theatrical ceremonies while adopting titles that horrified polite society. Rumors inevitably flourished. Were they sacrificing children, summoning demons, holding orgies, performing black masses? Probably not all of those, but most historians agree the club was far closer to an exclusive gentleman's club, with an aggressively anti-clerical sense of humor than a genuine religious movement. Their greatest act of rebellion wasn't worshipping the devil, it was refusing to take sacred authority seriously. That distinction matters, because throughout history, almost every group accused of Satanism either didn't believe in Satan at all, or didn't exist in the first place. By the 19th century, Satan had undergone something of a literary renaissance. Poets and authors began recasting him not as the horned monster of medieval sermons, but as the eternal rebel. Milton's Paradise Lost, despite intending quite the opposite, gave Satan charisma. Romantic writers found themselves fascinated by the figure who defied absolute authority even in certain defeats. Suddenly, the devil wasn't merely evil, he became symbolic. Artists painted him, philosophers referenced him, revolutionaries borrowed his imagery. Secret societies flirted with the infernal symbolism because they knew exactly how scandalous it would appear to the establishment. Once again, none of this amounted to a religion called Satanism. Be it literal or political, it was theater. Sometimes little more than wealthy eccentrics amusing themselves by frightening their neighbors. Even Aleister Crowley, another figure routinely described as the wickedest man in the world, who labeled himself even the Beast, never called himself a Satanist. He rejected Christianity entirely, but his own religious philosophy, Thelema, had little interest in Satan. His notoriety owed as much to sensational newspapers as it did to his own carefully cultivated public image. The drugs certainly didn't help. By the middle of the 20th century, the word satanic, or Satanist, still meant whatever frightened respectable society at the moment. There were occultists, ceremonial magicians, and spiritualists on the rise, atheists, radicals, artists, hell, everyone, it seemed, had been called satanic. But nobody had actually built a religion around the word. That would not happen until one bald, black-clad showman living in San Francisco decided to stop letting other people define the term and stepped in before someone less qualified did it. And in 1966, everything changed. On Walpurgis Nacht in San Francisco, Anton LaVey shaved his head, declaring the beginning of Year 1, Anno Satanis, and formally established the Church of Satan and the religion of Satanism. That sentence is remarkably simple, but the intent and the reality was not. For the first time in recorded history, someone wasn't merely being called a Satanist by frightened neighbors or hostile clergy. Someone had intentionally adopted the word, defined it, organized around it, and announced exactly what it meant. Whether one agreed with him or not was now beside the point. The definition finally belonged to someone willing to write it down. And the timing wasn't accidental. America in the mid-1960s was already questioning authority. Civil rights demonstrations filled the streets. Traditional religion was beginning to lose its unquestioned place in public life. Psychology was entering popular conversation, and sexual norms were changing. The counterculture was beginning to absolutely flower. Now, LaVey looked at all of this and concluded that mankind had outgrown supernatural religion, but it had not outgrown the need for ritual. That distinction would become the cornerstone of everything that followed, because before there was a church, there was simply a man with unusual interests. LaVey worked a remarkable assortment of jobs throughout his early life. Playing calliope for carnivals, he worked with lions and big cats, he photographed crime scenes for the SFPD, he performed as an organist in burlesque houses and spent years observing what he believed to be humanity, stripped of all its pretenses. On Saturday evenings, he would watch respectable churchgoers lust after dancers, and on the following Sunday morning, he'd see those same faces sitting in pews condemning vice. Whether or not you believe those tales to have been embellished in even the smallest bit doesn't matter. The story illustrates the point LaVey wanted to make. People are rarely who they pretend to be. Long before there was a satanic Bible, there were what became known as the Magic Circle lectures. Held at his home, later famous as the Black House. These evenings gathered artists, writers, police officers, scientists, occult enthusiasts, skeptics, and curiosity seekers to discuss everything from psychology and criminology to horror films, mythology, ritual, philosophy, and stage magic. Just a few of the things we've covered and will cover in the podcast. Many of the individuals who would become eventually known as the church's early leadership first met around these gatherings. People like Diane Hegarty, who became the church's first high priestess and one of its principal organizers. Edward Weber, who served as a publicist and the early administrator. Public figures like filmmaker Kenneth Anger and various notable underground artists passed through the orbit at various points, while later decades would eventually see figures such as Boyd Rice, Blanche Barton, and eventually Peter H. Gilmore becoming closely associated with the organization. Contrary to sensational media portrayals, the church was never built around secret aristocratic bloodlines or hidden conspiracies. It grew from a salon of eccentricity and free-thinking self-deists. Now, before the Satanic Bible ever reached bookshelf stores, there was an earlier project that LaVey had intended to release, an audio recording, the Satanic Mass. It was meant to contain a selection of rituals and invocations performed by LaVey, as well as a key selection of music. However, a myriad of problems with the publisher, the project kept getting put off further and further, and there were tons of other bands and projects coming out claiming combination of satanic and mass in the title, thus muddying the waters and making LaVey a bit apprehensive about being seen as a late adopter of the terminology instead of its factual creator. As such, rather than continue wrestling with records and deal with the inevitable comparisons and debates of originality, LaVey shifted his attention towards something far more permanent: a book. In 1969, Avon published the Satanic Bible. There was a persistent myth that the book appeared almost overnight. The reality is far more interesting. Much of its material had already existed as lecture notes, essays, ritual texts, and philosophical discussions developed during the Magic Circle years. LaVey was encouraged to expand that material into a commercially published work rather than a collection of mimeographed lectures circulating among members. Inspired and using portions of previous writings before him, many accuse the work of plagiarism. However, LaVey himself not only cites these works in the book, but the portions are less than 2% of the book proper. The full result became the single most influential document in Satanism. Not because every Satanist agrees with every sentence, but because it finally established a fixed definition. Before 1969, Satanism meant whatever one's enemies accused them of. After the late 60s, anyone could simply open a book and read what its founder actually intended. That's difficult to overstate. The church itself continued to evolve through the following decades. Media attention came in waves, sometimes welcome, sometimes deeply frustrating. Television appearances, interviews, documentaries, and magazine profiles transformed LaVey into perhaps one of the most recognizable faces of the decade. And he cultivated that image deliberately, from the cribbing of Ming the Merciless to his pet lion, Toger, the infamous Black House at 6114 California Street. Critics often mistook the aesthetic for the philosophy. LaVey understood something every showman knows. People remember aesthetics and symbols, and they have the power to sway, but it requires deep roots to make them stay. Anton LaVey died on October 29th, 1997. As with much of his life, controversy surrounded the circumstances, but the organization itself did not disappear with its founder. For a time, leadership fell to Blanche Barton, LaVey's longtime companion and fellow author. She served as high priestess during the difficult transition following his death, and helped stabilize the structure and thoughts of the group as an entity throughout this time. In 2001, leadership formally passed to Peter H. Gilmore as high priest, and later to his wife, Peggy Nadramia, as high priestess. Under Gilmore, the church shifted slightly away from the celebrity-driven image that had often surrounded LaVey himself, and towards a quieter institutional model. Public statements had become less frequent but more deliberate. Membership standards tightened. Publications continued through the Black Flame and later essays and books. Rather than attempting to become a mass movement, the church emphasized quality over quantity, preferring to remain a philosophical organization of elite rather than proselytizing religion. That, too, reflects one of its central principles. Satanism does not seek converts. It expects individuals to discover whether the philosophy already describes them. And that brings us to perhaps the most important distinction of the entire episode. We've spent nearly 2,000 years watching the words satanic drift throughout history, attached to witches, heretics, rebels, poets, occultists, aristocrats, and imagined conspiracies. In 1966, that drift stopped. For the first time, the term had a formal definition. The rest of this episode isn't about Anton LaVey the man. It's about the philosophy he codified, and why, over half a century later, people are still trying to argue about what the word Satanist actually means. Now, to get this out of the way first, before we begin with that, I think it's worth spending a few minutes talking about something that almost inevitably comes up when the word is mentioned today. The Satanic Temple. If you've listened this far, you may have already guessed where I'm going with this. I do not consider the Satanic Temple to be Satanism. Not a different denomination, another branch, or an alternate interpretation. Something else entirely. We've just spent the last portion of this episode establishing that the word Satanism acquired a formal meaning in 1966 with the foundation of the Church of Satan and was codified 3 years later with the publication of the Satanic Bible. Whether one likes Anton LaVey or not, that historical fact matters because it gave the religion a defined philosophy, rather than leaving the word to mean whatever happened to offend somebody. The Satanic Temple came decades later under very different circumstances. It was founded by filmmaker Doug Missico, better known as Doug Mesner or his pseudonym Lucian Greaves, and other friends including Malcolm Jerry. From its beginning as a prank, the organization eventually meandered towards political activism, public demonstrations, and legal challenges involving state and church issues for the sake of exposure and, quote-unquote, fighting against the religious. Satan was adopted less as a religious figure and more as a marketing mascot, a way to force themselves into the public eye. If your goal is political activism, that's a perfectly coherent strategy. Just not the same thing as Satanism. My disagreement isn't rooted in politics, it is rooted in purpose, and set definition versus false advertising. The Church of Satan has never tried to legislate its philosophy into law. It does not campaign for public schools to teach Satanism because we do not advocate for indoctrinating children. We don't fight to have our statues in public because it's entirely counterproductive. Their forever target of the religious right isn't going to suddenly change their mind and back down because a group of activists are dressed like goats and devils and succubi and redditors, and they're going to double down and push even harder on their doctrines and dogmas. When a courthouse installs a Ten Commandments monument that is later going to get removed due to actual anti-religious group protesters that know what they're doing, and someone responds by demanding a Baphomet statue beside it, the idea is that both sides will see just how silly the other one was doing and decide that both of them should go, and that government should simply stay out of religion altogether. The world doesn't work that way. Instead, it hardens opposition. It gives religious activists a new villain to rally against, positions become more entrenched, fundraising becomes easier, and everyone walks away more convinced that they're engaged in an existential battle. That's wonderful if your goal is political theater. It's considerably less useful if your goal is actually reducing religious conflict and withering the opposition's strength. And now, there's another difference that matters just as much. For the Church of Satan, Satan is a literary symbol representing pride, reason, indulgence, self-determination, and skepticism towards arbitrary authority, and the philosophy exists independently of political affiliation. A Satanist may vote however they wish. They may choose to support causes, or ignore politics entirely. The religion is not activism. Activism is something an individual Satanist may choose to do, but those are entirely different ideas. You don't have to agree with Anton LaVey. You don't have to like the Church of Satan. You certainly don't have to be a Satanist. But if we are going to use the words honestly, then definitions have to matter. Otherwise, we're right back where we started with this episode, using Satanism as a label for anything dramatic, controversial, or anti-Christian. We've already seen what 2,000 years of that confusion looks like. I'd rather not add another chapter to it. Now, before we move on, I would like to take a brief moment to talk about the so-called theistic Satanists. The ones who say, we're Satanists, we agree with you, we like Satanism. However, we think the devil exists, and we worship him. That's Christianity with extra steps. You're rooting for the loser of this story that you fully believe actually happened. And I can hear others, well, no, we don't worship Satan, it's Lucifer or Beelzebub or any other works of mythology that they might be so interested in. If it's something like that, call it something else. Do not call it Satanism. Do not call it theistic Satanism. It has nothing to do with Satanism. Call yourself a Beelzebubist, or do what the Luciferians do. But, as the Facebook group puts it, once again, that's not Satanism. All that out of the way, I'd like to start by examining the 9 satanic statements. And again, these are going to be my views on them. If you want it straight from the source, as Anton LaVey put it, go to churchofsatan.com and read them there. They are all freely available. I believe that if the essays and writings of the book are the meat of what the religion is, then these are the very bones and marrow of the dogma. Number 1. Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. This is probably the statement that most people have heard of, and also one of the most misunderstood. People hear the word indulgence and imagine reckless excess, endless consumption, hedonism without restraint, but that's not really what LaVey was getting at. The point wasn't to abandon self-control, it was to reject the notion that pleasure is inherently sinful. Hunger exists to be satisfied. Curiosity exists to be explored. Love, laughter, good food, good company, meaningful work, these are not distractions from life. They are life. Satanism doesn't celebrate deprivation for its own sake. It asks a much simpler question. If you only get one life, why spend it apologizing for enjoying it? Number 2. Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. This one has always struck me as a reminder to remain grounded. Satanism places its emphasis on the tangible world, the people around us, the experiences we have, and the lives that we are actually living, rather than the promises about another existence that cannot be verified. That doesn't necessarily one cannot appreciate mystery, mythology, or wonder. It simply means that our here and now deserves our full attention before we concern ourselves with hypothetical tomorrows and maybes. Number 3. Satan represents undefiled wisdom rather than hypocritical self-deceit. There's a certain brutal honesty woven throughout satanic philosophy, in that you are who you are, and you can change who you are. You can create this image of the is to be, which is the future, and make it so, but you have to beware of your own limitations. That can be uncomfortable. That could mean physically, that could mean mentally, that could be making up stories instead of making your own stories. Now, there's something to be said about illusion and trickery used on others for your own means, but this is self-deceit. This is being comfortable with your own uncomfortable truths and whatever limits you find therein. And that can also be existential, making up stories of gods or believing something somebody tells you because it makes you feel better about yourself rather than finding the truth or seeing the scientific reason. We are remarkably talented at constructing stories that excuse our failures, inflate our virtues, or shift blame elsewhere. Wisdom begins by stripping those stories away. Not because reality is always unpleasant, but because reality is the only place from which meaningful change can begin. Number 4. Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it, instead of love wasted on ingrates. This is probably one of the more controversial statements. Modern culture often treats kindness as something owed equally to everyone, regardless of their actions. LaVey challenged that idea. His position was that compassion becomes meaningless if it ignores character entirely. Relationships should be reciprocal. Respect should have a value. Loyalty should matter. Kindness isn't weakness, it's simply a resource worth investing wisely. Number 5. Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. This statement is often mistaken as an endorsement of perpetual revenge. I don't read it that way. Rather, it's a rejection of the expectation that one should simply accept abuse in the name of moral purity. There's times when boundaries must be enforced. There are moments when refusing to stand up for yourself simply teaches others that they may continue. Justice isn't gentle. Sometimes it simply means refusing to remain a victim. Number 6. Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. That's definitely one of the more memorable phrases when you first read the Bible if you haven't heard the term already, and one that got used in the zeitgeist a lot more later in the equation. Now, he wasn't talking about the supernatural, of course. He instead meant people who habitually drain the energy, generosity, and goodwill of everyone around them without ever offering anything in return. We've all known someone like that. This statement reminds us that compassion without boundaries can become exploitation. Helping someone who truly needs is admirable, but allowing yourself to become someone else's perpetual battery is something entirely different. Not only that, but responsibility to the responsible means taking account of your own actions and taking care of your own problems instead of simply pawning them off on others. Now, this doesn't mean asking for help. Again, we go back to reciprocity, the give and take of a true friendship or relationship. And number 7, Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those that walk on all fours, who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. Though this may read as degrading, it does not strip away human exceptionalism, as some may think, but rather shows us that we are mere animals. Not fallen angels, not divine beings trapped in flesh, not some chosen creation. We are animals. Remarkably intelligent ones, certainly. Creative, inventive, capable of extraordinary beauty, and opposable thumbs, but still part of nature rather than separate from it. Recognizing that isn't degrading, it can actually be liberating. And in fact, it is due in no small part to our false belief that we are more than animals that makes us so dangerous to one another, due to falsehoods and inflated sense of divine grace. Number 8. Satan represents all of the so-called sins as they lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. This statement circles back to where we began. Many of the behaviors historically listed as sins, curiosity, pride, ambition, desire, enjoyment, are simply ordinary parts of being human. Whether they become virtues or vices depends less on their existence than on how they're expressed. Fire can cook your dinner, it can also burn your house down. The tool itself isn't moral, only its application. And habitually, churches have tried to keep those tools away from us mere mortals. And lastly, number 9. Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, for he has kept it in business all of these years. LaVey closes the statements with a bit of wit. The existence of the adversary has always been useful to institutions, as fear creates urgency, creates loyalty, creates donations, attendance, and influence. Whether one agrees with that observation or not, it's difficult to deny the figure of Satan has occupied an astonishing amount of religious attention for a being that many traditions insist has already lost. Sometimes the villain is just as useful as the hero. Some would say perhaps even more so. Taken together, the 9 satanic statements aren't a checklist or a creed to be recited every Sunday. They're a philosophical introduction, a declaration that life is finite, and that individuality matters, that responsibility should outweigh guilt, and that we should strive to see the world as we would want it to be, rather than as we are told it should be. The rest of the Satanic Bible simply expands on those ideas. Sooner or later, every Satanist hears the same question. Okay, but what do you actually do? We've spent the better part of this episode talking about philosophy, history, and principles, and those are all well and good, but eventually someone wants to know what all of that looks like once you step outside and interact with the world. Do Satanists evangelize? No. Do we knock on doors? No. Do we hold weekly worship services? Again, no. Satanism has no obligation to recruit. In fact, Anton LaVey often remarked that Satanism isn't interested in gathering followers so much as identifying individuals who already think this way. If someone discovers the philosophy and finds that it describes them, wonderful. If not, well, that's perfectly acceptable as well. But that leaves us with another question. If Satanism isn't trying to save souls or convert the masses, does it have anything to say about society at all? In 1988, Anton LaVey published what he called pentagonal revisionism, 5 broad ideas that he believed would improve civilization over time. They're not dogma, they certainly aren't legislative proposals, and not a manifesto either for forcing change on unwilling people. They're aspirations, a picture of the sort of society that might naturally emerge if people embraced competence, responsibility, and individual excellence. So let's do a quick walk through them. The first is stratification. This inevitably becomes the most controversial point because the word itself carries a lot of baggage. LaVey was not talking about aristocracy or inherited privilege, quite the opposite. His argument was that people should rise or fall according to their own merit, rather than artificial equality, born privilege, and social obligation. Competence should matter. Achievement should matter. The person who consistently produces results should not be treated identically to someone who refuses to contribute simply because equality sounds nicer than excellence. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the principle is meritocracy rather than inherited status. Number 2, a strict taxation of all churches. This one tends to surprise people because it isn't aimed at Christianity alone. LaVey believed that if an organization enjoys the benefits of participating in society, it should contribute to society financially just like any other institution. The point isn't hostility towards religion, it's consistency. If a church owns property, operates businesses, or accumulates wealth, why should it enjoy exemptions unavailable to everyone else? Given the conversation surrounding megachurches over the past few decades, this point has arguably become more relevant than when it was first written, as well as to note that the Satanic Temple enjoys tax exemption status, while the Church of Satan rejects it. Number 3, no tolerance for religious beliefs in secular law. Notice the wording. It doesn't say people should not hold religious beliefs. It says those beliefs should not dictate law for those who do not share them. This is one of the more classically liberal ideas within Satanism. Believe whatever you wish, practice your own religion freely, just don't demand that everyone else organize their lives according to your sacred text. A secular government should remain exactly that, secular. Number 4, development of artificial human companions. Back in the late 1980s, this sounded like science fiction. Today, not so much. We've touched on it before in our episode of Immersion. LaVey imagined that many human needs, companionship, conversation, intimacy, even emotional support, could eventually be met through artificial beings. He wasn't arguing that machines should replace humanity, but rather suggesting that technology might one day free people from unhealthy dependence on destructive relationships. Considering the rapid pace of artificial intelligence and robotics over the last few years, this might be one of the points where LaVey proves again how prescient his ideas were. We talked quite a bit about this back in episode 11, so I suspect we will revisit again in the future. Number 5, the opportunity for anyone to live within a total environment of their choice. Again, if you listened to episode 11, this should sound familiar. LaVey believed people thrive when they have the ability to intentionally shape the spaces they inhabit. The environment changes the mind, and the mind changes the person. Rather than dismissing escapism as childish, Satanism tends to view careful and constructed environments as tools of emotional balance, creativity, and personal fulfillment. It is, of course, a point that resonated with me deeply enough to devote an entire episode on the subject. Taken together, pentagonal revisionism isn't a checklist for changing the world tomorrow morning. It's better understood as a thought experiment. If we were designing civilization from the ground up, what principles would produce stronger individuals and in turn a healthier society? You may agree with every point, you may reject half of them outright. That's perfectly fine. The important thing is recognizing that Satanism has always been more than theatrical imagery or provocative symbolism. Behind the black robes and popular mythology lies a surprisingly practical philosophy concerned with how people actually live, work, create, and interact with one another. If the 9 statements describe what Satanism values, and pentagonal or pentagonal revisionism sketches out a society those values might help create, then the 9 satanic sins are simply a list of behaviors that tend to get in your own way. They're less "thou shalt not" and more of "if you keep doing this, don't be surprised when life keeps punching you in the teeth." Let's briefly go through them. Stupidity is number 1, and LaVey placed it there for a reason. Not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected. Stupidity is the refusal to learn. It's having access to evidence and deliberately choosing fantasy instead. It's rejecting curiosity because certainty feels more comfortable. It's proudly remaining uninformed when information is readily available. One of the defining traits in Satanism is skepticism, not cynicism, but a willingness to ask questions and see those through. The moment we've decided we've learned enough is usually the moment we stop growing entirely, and for some people, that's a much shorter journey. Number 2 is pretentiousness. There's a difference between confidence and performance. Pretentiousness is dressing yourself up in borrowed importance, using complicated words to sound intelligence, cultivating an image instead of developing substance. And again, not to say that image isn't important, it's very important. What I'm saying is a false image that you have no support behind. This cardboard image when you're in reality everything but the heroic image in front of you. It's surprisingly common in occult circles, philosophy, academia, honestly, just about everywhere. If who you are requires constant theatrical reinforcement instead of genuine talent or backbone, perhaps the performance has become more important than the person. And you have to ask what you're gaining from this and if it's really beneficial to yourself. Number 3, solipsism. Now, this one deserves more explanation because it's a word many people never encounter. And in fact, it has many different definitions. But as it's intended here, solipsism is the mistake of assuming everyone feels, thinks, and values the world exactly as you do. Being solipsistic is projecting your own motivations on everyone else, expecting everyone to have the same standards or react in the same way that you yourself would. The result is constant disappointment. You expect honesty because you would have been honest, or gratitude because you would have been grateful. People don't work that way. Understanding others means recognizing that they are genuinely different from you, not just broken versions of yourself, only half performing like they should. Number 4, self-deceit. This circles back to one of the 9 statements. Lying to other people can sometimes be strategic. Lying to yourself is always catastrophic. We all create stories, comforting ourselves, telling ourselves we'll start next week. We insist we're victims when we are participants. We convince ourselves we're making progress while standing perfectly still. These stories become a detriment to growth, and once we cast them aside and start dealing with the facts of our own existence, that's when we start to progress. Number 5, herd conformity. Satanism values individual judgment. This doesn't mean disagreeing simply to appear rebellious. Sometimes the crowd is absolutely correct. The problem begins when agreement becomes automatic. History is full of ideas that seemed unquestionable right up until they weren't. Thinking independently means examining consensus rather than worshipping it. Number 6, lack of perspective. This may be one of the most useful reminders on the entire list. Humans have a remarkable ability to make themselves the center of every story. Every inconvenience a catastrophe, a disagreement is a battle, every criticism is a personal attack. We've covered this on our episode on aeons and other bits, I believe. Sometimes stepping back is enough to realize the universe wasn't revolving around us in the first place. Perspective has a way of shrinking problems down to their actual size and making the path ahead clearer. And now this does go both ways, because a lot of people don't understand the amount of control they have over their own environment and the power that their will can have on affecting their worlds. Not the world in general, usually, though if you have a strong enough will, that is totally possible. But I digress, and this will be covered much more on a later episode, focusing on greater and lesser magic. Back to the point, a lack of perspective can be anything from not having a plan to move forward to believing that the cliff you're about to walk off of actually falls into a giant foam pit when in reality it's spikes. Number 7, forgetfulness of past orthodoxies. As we've said before numerous times, ideas have life cycles. Today's rebellion often becomes tomorrow's establishment. Yesterday's radical eventually becomes today's authority. LaVey warned against forgetting that. Whenever we assume we've permanently escaped dogma, we should probably check whether we've simply adopted a newer version. History has a habit of repeating itself whenever people stop paying attention to it. Number 8, counterproductive pride. Pride itself is not the enemy. Satanism generally celebrates healthy pride. The problem is refusing to admit when your pride is costing you more than it's giving you. Sometimes apologizing is the strong way forward, or changing your mind is an evolution of yourself. Sometimes admitting you were wrong is the most confident thing you can do. An ego should serve the individual, not imprison them. And finally, number 9, lack of aesthetics. Now, this final sin tends to confuse people. At first glance, it sounds superficial, but it's anything but. LaVey believed beauty has genuine psychological value. The spaces we inhabit affect our mood, the clothes we wear influence how we carry ourselves. Music, architecture, ritual, design, all intrinsic parts of this podcast, and even the simple act of arranging a room intentionally, as we covered in Immersion, can shape the way we experience life. Beauty isn't frivolous, it's nourishing. And like I said, we've danced around this idea several times. Aeons touched on humanity's drive to create meaning. Immersion explored environments we build around ourselves. Horror, folklore, ritual, they all demonstrate the same truth. People need beauty, not because it feeds the body, but because it feeds something equally important. And if you don't know what I'm referring to there, well, it's between your eyes. And there it is. No harming of children or animals unless it's for food. Animals, not children, you heathens. No sacrifices, no conspiracies. But I'm sure if you came into this believing that, I won't sway you anytime soon. Thank you for sticking with this one. It's a bit more personal than usual, sure. Possibly a controversial one, and definitely going to be the longest episode, but well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? Again, you can't hear me smirk and wink, but let's just assume it. So, let's crack open a cold one this time as we enter the decompression chamber.
Cerveza cristal. Cerveza cristal.
Yeah, I highly recommend LaVey's article on Satanism as the Cosmic Joy Buzzer. Comedy and the devil go very hand in hand. Shout out to Magister Bill, host of the Devil's Mischief and the Satan's Plain podcast, for always reminding me of that one. If you don't know what that audio bit was from, I highly recommend looking it up. Long story short, when the original Star Wars movies were broadcast in Chile back in December 2005, or it was around the early 2000s, they had this genius marketing strategy to work beer commercials into the broadcast, as in scenes added to the movies. It was brilliant. There are several clips and compilations on YouTube. Just search Star Wars Cerveza. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. Satan, where to start? Well, first off, I want to say, if you're interested and want to learn more, just go out and buy the actual Satanic Bible. It's usually less than $10, and any digital or online copy you find is a guaranteed fake with dubious authenticity, since the church has never authorized or do they have the rights to a digital release. Avon Publishing holds it like a vice and doesn't seem to be loosening on that point anytime soon. And I can actually hear people back there listening to the podcast and hitting the, well, actually... Well, look, despite what you may have heard, LaVey never had a deathbed conversion, and almost all of the post-death doubt over his stories and backgrounds were put out posthumously by people with their own agenda. The man was a storyteller for sure, but for more information, listen to Satan's Plain episode number 84, Debunking the Last Words of the LaVey Hoax. So let's see here. Actual satanic musicians. Sammy Davis Jr. hung around the church sometime, but I'm not going to claim that one. King Diamond was, of course, the first openly satanic musician, and there's precious little actual, like, quote-unquote, actual satanic music out there. Natasha Gray's earlier work with the Nathan Gray Collective, such as Until the Darkness Takes Us, was literal satanic philosophy, gospel-esque rock. I mean, very decent stuff from a then member of the church. Not sure if she's still active in those circles or not. On the subject, though, no, Ghost and Twin Temple do not count. Now, don't get me wrong either. I love Ghost's artistry and their music, and very good musicians. But they are performers, pure and simple. Same with Twin Temple. Nothing to do with actual Satanism, just the rock and roll imagery. And to be perfectly clear, all this backlash and bull about Satanism in the wake of their little publicity thing, I don't blame the artists at all. Just chuds on the internet averse to doing any actual research before they talk. That's an insidious little trick TST used to rope people in too. Their 7 tenets that I keep hearing everybody say is grounds for them being satanic. Those have been remade and redone time and time again, and were basically thought up on the spot as a, what 7 things can we pick that pretty much everybody will agree on? See episode, I have that written down, number 73 on Satan's Plain for a breakdown on that. Oh, that's something else we can hit on. Membership in the Church of Satan. It is not required to be a member to call oneself a Satanist, only to read the book and identify yourself in it. As of this episode, I am not currently a member. When I started this podcast, I removed all of my username adornments of Warlock, as it is a membership level in the church. I wanted to avoid any misunderstandings. So why am I not a member? Simply put, I've never really had the spare money for it. Now, I could have set it aside, saved it up, found it somewhere within my past, I want to say 20 some odd years as a self-identified Satanist, sure. But I wasn't happy with that. If I was to apply to the church for active membership, I wanted it to be with money I had made doing something I was proud of, something I could claim as my own and offer as worthy of membership. As such, when and if this podcast gets monetized in some way down the line, like ads, merch, Patreon donations, whatever, that first little $225 I make is going straight to the little red card as a testament of my will and success made manifest. On that note, donations can be made to... I'm kidding. Now, this has already been the longest episode I've recorded, but I want to take a little bit of extra time here at the end in the decompression chamber to read and reflect on a few of my favorite quotes that regard Satanism, either directly or indirectly. Number one, there is always tomorrow until there isn't. It's unknown who this quote originally came from. The sentiment is short, succinct, and enough to ponder. While sloth naturally has its rewards, one must take action. It also carries a warning about aiming for lofty aspirations. If at first you don't succeed, don't burn out trying it again and again. Find a lower branch to grasp at first. Being born in a stable does not make one a horse. The Duke of Wellington. While the nature of man is malleable, the science of his stock is not. Until science trumps this fact, it must be acknowledged. St. Bernards don't win races. Now, to clarify, this one has been adopted and used by a lot of idiots, racists especially. Not the same intent as me. To sum it up in other words, mind your limits and set your standards realistically. If you have a bad back and can't see well, MMA is probably not going to be where you shine. A truly strong person does not need the approval of others any more than a lion needs the approval of sheep. Vernon Howard. Another one, sadly, adopted by some very chudly people. I believe this is, at its core, about finding your tribe. The lamb, no, but the approval of his fellow hunters, on the other hand, can mean the difference between being part of the whole or being discarded. Surround yourself with those in whom you find merit, and see to it that they see you the same. Normal is an illusion. What is normal to the spider is chaos to the fly. Charles Adams. It's a fantastic quote from a man truly before his time. It's all too easy to fall victim to the folly of humanity, solipsism and perception. We effortlessly swat the fly without blinking an eye, but if some otherworldly entity were to begin swatting us, we would no doubt label it as evil. Nature is Satan's church. Lars von Trier. Now, while I disagree with much of what the man does and has to say, and don't always like his movies, this quote definitely hits a mark. Where, more than the untamed wilds, the rules of nature we so endear take root. Where the laws and powers we hold dear have the mightiest sway in the very nest they sprang from. Hail Satan indeed. Those who play with the devil's toys will be brought by degrees to wield his sword. Buckminster Fuller penned this quote, no doubt, as a cautionary verse. How small degrees of sinister action can come in part to become a much greater evil. Quotes and attributions can easily change meanings depending on context. Just as easily as one sees caution in that quote, I can make sense of it being a powerful self-improvement motto. To embrace the name Satan is to avow skepticism in the face of all things, even, especially, that which is held sacred. Anton LaVey. And here we see the most succinct way of putting the anthem of the adversary. It's a simple understatement, but one that holds the heart of our ideals. Human history, in many aspects, is a global tour of religion-inspired abattoir. Peter H. Gilmore. Here the high priest skewers, in his usual bombastic fashion, the very nature of the faithful. a history of blood and torture that would put any horror movie to shame. Naturally, the retort is usually, well, if it wasn't for religion, humans would find something else to kill each other over. But this defeatist rhetoric is the product of imagination alone. Yes, we kill, we conquer, we destroy, but our malice has its endpoints once we have our fill and we can settle into our own nations, with the occasional skirmish over resources. But religion is the venom that is ever preventing of peace. Mixing it up a bit, a quote from Adam Savage from Mythbusters fame is definitely one of my favorites, and he says, "I have concluded through careful empirical analysis and much thought that somebody is looking out for me, keeping track of what I think about things, forgiving me when I do less than I ought, giving me strength to shoot for more than I think I'm capable of. I believe they know everything that I do and think, and they still love me. And I've concluded, after careful consideration, that this person keeping score is me." Wow. I highly doubt that Adam Savage is a Satanist. I could be wrong with a quote like that, but that is such a good quote, one I use quite often. And finally, one that needs no explanation. There is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance. Socrates. And whew, what an episode. On that note, let's wind it down and set our sights for next Friday, our 13th episode, Superstition. Until then, keep the fire stoked and the lanterns full. This has been Liam Blackwood, and you've been listening to Occam's Lantern. And yeah, my voice has been really off this week. The wildfires in Canada, the smoke coming into Michigan. I apologize if this sounds weird in any way. Hail Satan.